Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about something called the cardiac cycle, which you do in both biology and I believe you do in PE lessons, and it's usually in Key Stage 4, so it's done at GCSE, perhaps more in detail if you were to do triple science over double science rather, because this goes into quite some depth and it's certainly something that you see at A level and IB. So the cardiac cycle in itself is or explains what's going on during the heartbeat. So where blood is moving from, where it's going to, and why those changes happen. It's not to do with so much of how the heartbeat is actually coordinated and controlled. I talked about that in another video. This is just the sequence of events that really occur in the cardiac cycle. So we're going to use this diagram that has been labelled to talk through the series of events. So the first thing that would happen would be blood coming in. In fact, we'll just talk through what we've got here. We've got the heart in, it should really be coloured in red and blue because that implies that the blood patch is of different colour, but it's just more for the visual representation of it. You've got the right side, which is over here, the left side on this point here. On the right side, so we've got blood coming in to the vena cava, this vessel here, and it's going to work its way around the right hand side. I'll obviously expand on more on this. And we've got the left side over here with blood coming into the pulmonary vein. So that's just quickly to orientate ourselves. So the first thing that's going to happen is blood is actually going to enter both atria, so the left atrium and the right atrium on both sides of the heart. So we're going to have blood coming in through the pulmonary vein. Pulmonary means lung and vein because it's to the heart. So blood is going to come in through the pulmonary vein and fill up our left atrium, and at the same time blood will come from, it says vein from head, but part of the vessel here is continued by this vessel at the bottom here, the vein coming from the body. We have ultimately the superior and inferior vena cava, that's returning blood from the body and the head to the right side of the heart. So it's going to come through this vena cava, it's going to come down and it's going to fill up this space here, space in the right atrium. That's the first stage. And that first stage, if I will shrink the screen just a little, that first stage is called Atrial Diastole. Atrial because it's involving the atrium on both sides, and diastole is the scientific word for a period of relaxation, so when the heart isn't actively contracting. So atrial diastole is when both atria fill with blood. Now we have, and it's not labelled on here, so I'll just circle them in, I use green. We have the atrioventricular valves, one here and one here. Now the one on the left is called the bicuspid valve, one on the right is the tricuspid valve. And those valves are there to prevent the backflow of blood. Now the cardiac cycle really is controlled not just by volume of blood in one chamber, but largely by pressure. Blood moves from where there's high pressure to low pressure, and it's that really dictates when all the valves open. So we're going to, first of all, let's just take the left side and explain what's going on the left side. When the blood is in the atrium, there is high pressure, and yet there is low pressure in the ventricle. So because there's that difference, the blood will move down into the ventricle, and so this valve will open to allow that to happen. So the valve opens and then blood will start to fill up in this ventricle. Same thing on the right side. Because there's higher pressure in the atrium than in the ventricle, the valve will open to allow blood flow, and the ventricles will start to fill up. Now, when those atria contract to push the blood through, that is called atrial systole. Systole this time means contraction. So atrial systole is when the atria contract, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves open, and because of the pressure difference, the ventricles start to fill with blood. When those ventricles are filling with blood, we can see that that would be a period of ventricular diastole. The ventricles would be relaxing to allow them to fill with blood. Now, at the point when the ventricle, we'll just take the left one again, at the point when this ventricle has more blood in than the atrium, and there's a higher pressure in the ventricle than in the atrium, to stop blood flowing backwards, the valve closes. And the same on the right side too. So at the point when there is more blood inside the ventricle than in the atrium, and the pressure is greater in the ventricles than in the atria, those bicuspid and tricuspid valves close to stop blood going backwards with that kind of pressure gradient. So let's talk about the next step. So we have blood in our ventricles, and we need to pump that out essentially. On the left side, we're going to pump that out the aorta to deliver oxygenated blood around the body, and on the left side, that's what we're doing, and on the right side, we're going to pump the blood up out of the pulmonary artery to go to the lungs to pick up some more oxygen, because on the right side we're dealing with deoxygenated blood. Now, if I colour in another colour, we actually have two other valves, one here and one here. They're called, I'll just circle them a bit more to make them more visible. These are called the Semi-Lunar Valves. One is within the aorta, one within the pulmonary artery, and they're shut at the moment. So you can imagine that we have more blood in the ventricles than we do currently, where I'm just putting two asterisks at this point here in the aorta and at this point here, so beyond the valve. So because now we have high pressure and lots of blood in the ventricle, and not a great deal or less pressure beyond the valves in the actual aorta and pulmonary artery, blood will therefore move with that pressure in this direction. So it'll go through the valves and up those blood vessels. So clearly the semi-lunar valves this time will open to allow that to happen. So just to recap, higher pressure in the ventricles, lower pressure beyond the valves in the aorta and pulmonary artery, so blood goes from where it's high pressure to low and will move up, it gets pumped up, and those semi-lunar valves open. And in the same way, and I'll shade this in red again, in the same way we had before, perhaps I'll use a darker red this time, just to show it a bit clearer here. When we have more blood in the aorta and blood in the pulmonary artery, at greater pressure compared to that in the ventricles, that's when the semi-lunar valves again will close to prevent blood flowing backwards. So this whole thing is controlled by pressure. When pressure is high in the atrium, low in the ventricle, it moves into the ventricle. When it's higher in the ventricle than it is in the blood vessels that it's going to move into, it moves out the ventricles into those blood vessels. Now when the ventricle contracts, that we call ventricular systole. So the ventricle contractions. So diastole means relaxation, systole means contraction. And clearly after a period of ventricular systole, the whole heart would then be in a period of diastole, a period of relaxation, because the atria will fill up again. So this will just cycle. We'll have the atria relaxing, then contracting, And while the atria are contracting, the ventricles will relax and fill with blood. The ventricles then, once filled with blood, will contract to push that blood out, and then the whole heart will have a period of relaxation or diastole to allow the top two chambers, the atria, to fill up again. And that ultimately is the cardiac cycle. The key thing to remember in exam questions is that it's all really a matter of pressure and blood moving from where there's high pressure to low pressure. And those valves are important because they stop blood going backwards. That's their job ultimately. Now, I'd like to just talk about a particular graph. This is a graph seen in many textbooks on the internet. You can find this kind of graph anywhere, and what it shows is not just aortic pressure, so the pressure in the aorta itself, but we also have pressure in the atrium, we have pressure in the ventricle shown by the yellow line on the right hand side, and then we've got ventricular volume on the bottom. And then we've got reference points to the valves, the semi-lunar valves closing, and the AV, the atrioventricular valves opening and closing. I just want to talk through this graph and explain what the setup is essentially. So if we look at the top, in this first phase here, this story or this graph is picking up when the atrium is contracting, so a period of atrial systole. And we said that when the atria contracts, the ventricle relaxes. So that's what we have here, although that's spelt slightly dodgy looking. But so when the atrium contracts, the ventricle relaxes. And we can see that the ventricle during that period would fill with blood. So that's why the ventricle volume increases. We know that if the atrium is pushing blood in, then logically we can see that we'll have our AV valve open to let that blood flow through. But at the start of the next phase, so on this first dotted line here, we're going to have to close that valve to stop blood going backwards. So then we have a period, so in this second phase on the graph here, where the atrium relaxes and the ventricle is now going to contract and push the blood out. So clearly we're going to need to open our semi-lunar valves. We can see in yellow this really significant rise in ventricular pressure, particularly coming from the left. The left ventricle is a very thick muscular wall because it has to push blood essentially all around the body to oxygenate the tissues. So as you can see, as that pressure rises, we also have an equivalent drop in ventricular volume. Then we get to our third sort of phase shown by this graph, where the heart is relaxing, both the atrium and ventricle are in a period of diastole. So the atrium logically would be filling with blood again. Now, what we have here, if I just circle in red, we can see that during this period of relaxation, in this third phase, this third block I'm looking at on this graph, we can see that we've got the AV valve opening here and an increase in ventricular volume. Now that does happen to a slight extent just to allow the ventricle to fill a little bit with blood. Before the atrium really is going to contract and push it all in. So during that period of diastole, the valve does open, the AV valve does open slightly to allow a little bit of blood to fill up in that ventricle. You can see, just to get it back almost, if you were to draw a little line across here, almost to like our base level, before the atrium really does contract and push the blood through. So I just wanted to explain that unusual sort of part of this graph here. But the key thing really to remember is that it's all about pressure. And you would never get this graph and be asked to analyse it, but you would certainly be expected to know that blood moves from the atrium to the ventricle where there's high pressure to low, valve opens during, and then when the blood's full in the ventricle, the AV valve is shut. And then when the ventricle has high pressure in there because of the volume of the blood compared to the volume of blood within the aorta and pulmonary artery, the semi-lunars open to let that blood flow through. And when there's a higher pressure of blood beyond the valves, the valve will close to prevent it going backwards. That ultimately is our cardiac cycle. Okay, I hope all that helps.